from Authors Buzz, and I am here with Tabitha again. Hi, Tab.
Hello, Amy.
Today we are going to talk about the subject of writing romance. So this is a very beginner discussion, and Tabitha, let's get going.
Sure. So we'll start by saying, it is a beginner discussion, kind of laying some of the ground rules for writing romance. What are some of the tropes and subgenres, and what your readers might expect? Maybe a little bit about how much steam do you put into your story? And then in later topics, I think we can talk about how do you write a successful romantic hero and heroine, and just some other topics there's so much to talk about. This is not your mama's Harlequin romance anymore. Not that there's anything wrong with those Harlequins. I've picked up a few recently and they're quite good. But it's an explosive industry.
I remember your mom having them.
Yep. And don't you remember earmarking certain pages and like coming back to them? Come on, we all have that dirty little secret, right? So, there's just something about romance, that I think is, gives us this fantasy, and yet there's enough that we can relate to in the stories. I don't know. I like to feel good at the end of my books. So romance, I do enjoy them if they're well done. So
Sure.
I don't know. Where do you want to start? You want to start with like
So let's start with, there's lots of different kinds of subtopics or subgenres within romance. What are some of them? And tell us a little bit about what you have written in.
Sure. So I would say that romance can tip into, it's one of those genres that you can really blend with other genres, right? Like I wrote a 3-book science fiction series, and it is billed as a science fiction, but it does have a thread of relationship in there. That relationship is fundamental to the story, and you want those characters to succeed. You're invested in them. But I wouldn't say it's not a romance with sci-fi elements. It's a sci-fi with romance elements in it. So you kind of want to look at what's the story you want to tell, and how central is this romantic relationship, and are you planning on having a happy ending? That is a really important thing, because for it to be a romance, for romance readers to say, to not be angry with you at the end, you need to give them that satisfy, that happy, that ending, that I keep saying happy ending, and I'm gonna just blush.
Awful. It's awful. Satisfying. I mean, that's not working either.
Nope,
I
nope,
think we're
because
both.
it really does have to be happy. They have to go away happy for now, or
Yeah.
happy forever.
Yeah, but happily ever after is
Happily ever
really,
after. It's key.
if there's not a marriage.
So when
So,
you're,
well,
yeah, go ahead.
so let's just back up a little bit. One of the things we both know is you might be writing in another genre, and you might have sex scenes, but the sex scenes are not really going to get into it. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so, oh gosh, there's so much to talk about. So when I'm writing sexy scenes, if I'm writing them in my romance, I might be more willing to go into detail, because I think my readers are expecting a little more. That's not to say you can't have a romance and just keep the bedroom door shut, right? And all the other human elements, the conflicts, the whatever's happening, you just don't want to dive into the details of what goes on in the bedroom. You are welcome to do that. That is still a romance, and it's just,
Does that sell, Tab? Does that sell these days?
I think it sells to a certain, honestly, without having statistics and stuff, I do think it does for a particular audience. And I do think it lends itself towards particular subgenres better than others, right? So having said that, there isn't a right or wrong answer here. There's just, think through. I always think through, what am I trying to reveal through the sex encounters between my characters? I kind of look at them a little bit like action scenes. They have a purpose, and they have, they're illuminating something. They're moving the storyline along a little bit. So I won't put one in just gratuitously, even into my romance books, because I feel like they need to have purpose. So in some cases, it's revealing something about the characters, like their inhibitions, their shyness, their quirks, their kinks, whatever. It's showing you something about these two individuals that you won't get any other place other than in the bedroom, and other than when they're in an intimate moment with one another. So that's a reason to include a sex scene. Payoff. These guys have been circling each other and circling each other, or they've been arguing and arguing, and finally you get them together, and you get this really explosive, wonderful, intimate scene. That's a payoff for your readers and for your characters. So those are some reasons to put in you know, but again, how detailed you want to go, how open you want that door to be, that's up to you as a writer. And it's up to you knowing the audience that you're gearing this towards, right? So yeah, that's kind of what I would say about the sexy parts. Different than erotica. Erotica, in my opinion, and I think I'm pretty widely read in this area, both romance and erotica and elsewhere. The point of erotica is often the sex, right? And there might be a story that's created around it, and that story may be very compelling and may be very good, but you're kind of in it for those scenes. You're kind of in it for this.
Would you say 50 Shades of Grey? Where does that fall? Just for
It's
people who
it's
know.
a blend, but I think it was originally billed as erotica because they, you know, she was really about exploring the world of kink, right, and BDSM, and before then there were very few novels that were mainstream that did that. So I think she went that way and it became a mainstream, and she did put a story around it, and whatever you want to
Right.
say
Well, that's what
about.
I'm saying. Is it a romance? Is it an erotic? It's an erotic, really an
It's an
erotic
erotic
romance.
romance, I think.
It's
Is
not. So there's also, is there a difference between erotic romance and just erotica too, right?
Yeah, I mean, sure. But how much can you write with just a sex scene? Right? You can probably write little blurbs and snippets and short scenes, but if you want to create a whole novel, you still need to add the human element into it. There still needs to be more to it. But that, I mean, back in the day, do you remember the book 9.5 Weeks that they turned into a movie? This is like, I'm going back to the
Of
80s and
course.
90s now.
Yes.
Remember? And that's erotica. Now, was there a relationship between these two people? Did you get to know the characters? Did you? Yeah, but really what you were doing was you were following them on an erotic journey until it ended, right? And that was the point of it. And 50 Shades, similar, except that she brought in more of a, they end up together, they have
Yeah.
their
Well, they
happily
have a
ever
happy
after.
ending. Yeah.
They have their
Nine and a
happy
half weeks.
ending. But I would say you're following along that story because you're on their erotic journey with them to some degree. So, you know, there's no right or wrong. Again, it's what are you creating for your readers, and what story do you want to tell, and what do you want to include in it?
What do you want? I think we have to go back to what we talk about when we talk about writing our own stories. Write something you want to read.
Right.
So don't write for the market. Write something that if you are interested in reading this romance or this erotic romance, you'd be interested,
Right.
because also what's going to happen is if you're successful, that's, I don't want to say you're going to be stuck, but that's what whoever you have, an agent, or even if you're self-published and your readers are buying them, they're going to want that. If it's descriptive, they're going to want descriptive. If it's, getting into all kinds of other kink and stuff, they're going to want that. Or if it's just kind of that, there was somebody we've both read who did historical romance, and she never showed anything, but it was all about that tension between the two characters. And so I was thinking like historical romance might be a place for
Sure.
that kind of.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be,
But I'm even thinking about the fantasies, like the Sarah J. Maas and Jennifer Armentrout. So they're writing fantasies with a strong romantic element in it. So that is when people know that's what they're getting, that's different than if you go and you decide to pick up Lord of the Rings or one of the other, more traditional high fantasies, right? So these women are writing, mostly women are writing fantasies with as much world building and as much plot action as any fantasy that's out there. But the romantic relationship is taking a very, very important role in the storytelling. And I think that's cool. And as long as we're being honest about what we're doing, right? And because you want to market to the right people, essentially. Once your story is told, you want it to reach the people who love that, right? So
sure. Well, I have a funny story about that. I think is it Jennifer Armentrout?
Armentrout, yep.
Yeah. I got her book on tape, not realizing that it was like fantasy romance. I didn't know about the romance part at all. And I'm listening, I'm like, like there was just like these little clues that I was like, did I accidentally like purchase a book on tape that's a romance? So that actually kind of brings us into like the tropes. Like what are the things that these. So first of all, what does the word trope mean? Because I didn't know what that meant.
It's a hard one for me to define. I think it's just sort of like a subcategory, like a you don't want to say cliche, but they sort of are if you were to list out all the cliches in the romance novels, you'd probably get all the tropes. You get the enemies to lovers, the friends to lovers, the secret baby, the the crush on your brother's friend, you know, like there's all of these
Sure.
tropes, which you know, I like, they're almost synonymous with cliche, yet they work because people want to read them. They're popular, and they are tropes and they are cliches because actually they do work, right? If they're done well. Of course, they can be done stale and they can be done whatever, but you have all those. So if you can think about any different way that a couple can get together, the meet cute, you know, or there's all these different ways that couples can get together. The boy next door, the girl next door, those are tropes. I think in my opinion, I separate those from the subgenres or the subcategories of romance, because they're sort of like they're even drilling down more as to the specifics of the relationship. Whereas, so you have romance, you can have historical romance, right? So that means it's set somewhere in the past, and then this, you know, research about setting it authentically in another time. You can have your fantasy romance where, you know, now you've got dragons or you've got vampires or you've got whatever, and that's in there. You can have the sci-fi romance, you know, again, it's set in space on different planets, but the romance is central. You can have your romantic suspense, which is what I mostly write, which is, of course, there's some kind of
And paranormal, that's a big field right now.
paranormal romance. Absolutely. So those big categories underneath are more when you're thinking about how are you going to set your story? What are the big overarching themes that are going to be part of it? Like if you're writing romantic suspense, you really need to think about what is the suspenseful element? What's the mystery that needs to be solved, or the danger that has to be overcome? If you're writing a contemporary romance, that's really more of the angsty relationship driven, you know, modern day romance. Historical, that speaks for itself, fantasy, paranormal stuff. So those are all the big categories underneath romance that you can choose what world you want to play in the romance world. Then you drill down to those tropes and you think, well, this one is going to be the bodyguard falls in love with the, you know, whatever, or this one has, you know, the boy next door that she's been. So then you can drill down into those tropes and see which ones fit and which ones makes you excited, or who starts spinning in your head. And they're super fun. I can't stress this enough. You know, I wrote my romance line during COVID because I felt like I needed to have some fun and just get my mind off of these, you know, big thematic topics of genocide and, you know, and big, yeah, whatever. And I wanted to write stuff that made people feel good at the end. And now it's me, so I have to have the dark stuff in there. So I have all the romance and the serial killers and the stalkers and whatever. But at the end of the day, the characters come out on top and they win. And that's a fun
And
place
we've talked about that's why we like the superhero stories. That's why we like the romances.
Right.
Sometimes we just need, like, I don't want to say an easy win because they do have to work for it, but compared to what's happening in some of the other kind of novels where the struggle is basically ongoing,
Right.
sometimes it's almost like a palate cleanser. It sounds like that's what you did with your writing. How do you get started? Like, I know we talked about writing, but is there something different you need to do to get started in romance?
Well, I would say go back to, like, you know, what world do you want to play in first? Are you looking at making you know, a small town home cooked romance, you know, between the boy next door and the whatever? If that's where your mind is going and that's where you're starting to swirl, then that's where you begin. If you're like me and you can't help but deal with these big plots and actions and stuff like that, all right, then you know that maybe romantic suspense or a historical romance that's set in a, you know, World War II or World War I or something like that might be for you. So I would just say with this, really dive into what's interesting to you. Like you said earlier, Amy, what would you like to read? And what kind of relationships do you enjoy reading about? You know, and start thinking that way. You know, again, a historical romance is going to need more research to get that authenticity, that sense of place. A sci-fi or fantasy romance is going to need more world building. A romantic suspense is going to need some plot action, some serious plot action to make, you know, to drag along and create suspense or create danger. And contemporary romance is going to really need the character building and really get into the nitty gritty of these people's, you know, lives. So just what do you like? What do you like to read? And who's speaking to you in your head? You know?
Right? And I think maybe this question might also turn into a whole nother video at another time. But I have to ask, how much sex or sexy scenes or with the bedroom door closed type scenes do readers expect? And how long can you wait before you get them together, before your readers lie?
Well, it's interesting because I've written 4 romance and they're romantic suspense. So I can only kind of speak from that writing perspective and then as a reader of that. And I would say first, it has to me, the sexy scenes have to fit, right? If I'm not writing erotica and the point isn't about the sex, then where is it in the story that it makes sense, that it feels like right, that it gets the payoff? And this can speak a little bit to the pacing that we were talking about last week. You can write this whole story and someone can read it and be like, I was so frustrated that it was too long that they were going around and going around and going around. That's great feedback because then you can come back and say, okay, I didn't give them enough here to be satisfying and to not be frustrating. And so I can rearrange some things. I can make this big reveal happen here. I can make this moment happen here instead of here. You can play with it. So I would say the same advice I would give in any writing: write your story, get your characters out, get that main conflict or the main plot points and all that stuff out, and then come back and see if it's the right pace for this relationship and for your readers and engaging in that. And I had one, but it was interesting that you mentioned that question because in the 4th book in the series that I write, the romance series, the very, very beginning, I mean, my main character gets shot. He's out of commission. He's really injured for a good chunk of the book. And so when they're hunkered down together and they're, all of the fireworks are starting to happen between them, this poor guy really can't do much. So I had to keep that in mind. I'm like, well, I can't make him like throw her down on the bed and, whatever, because he kind of can't, so how do I work with that, with this story, and make the payoff and the tension so there was a lot of softer moments, and this couple were definitely some, not quite an enemies to lovers, but it was a, just like she was really just skeptical of him. He was a playboy and whatever, and kind of that kind of character. And she was super,
that's right there.
Nope, right there. Yep.
Yep.
Drummer in a rock band, and she's the bodyguard. So I did that reverse bodyguard thing. So, a whole bunch of tropes happening. But I had to think about what's the story? What are the circumstances that I just made for these characters? And how can I make it have enough up and down, enough intimacy, enough moments of sexy times, but still be true to the fact that this poor guy is injured for like 3/4 of the book. So I had to be a little creative about it, but yet I think it worked because I really thought about that and I thought about the reader experience. And there was more softer moments between the two of them that felt satisfying because they were cutting through their assumptions about one another. And they could do that just snuggling on the couch. They didn't have to be, naked and tumbling, we'll say. So, I think it's like, ask yourself, what's the point of those hot, sexy scenes? And then you'll know where to place them. Is it payoff after this? And then maybe you did wait too long. And maybe your early readers are going to tell you that was just, I was so frustrated by this point, and you say, okay, I can work with that pacing. I don't know. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. And maybe, I feel like also for somebody who's new to writing and new to romance, you and I might need to do some more structured information for those people. So we'll think, we're gonna
put our heads together, think about that.
Yeah, maybe we'll write something in tandem on a Zoom, but not a Zoom that we're gonna show to you all until we're done. And I think that's a good place to pause here. And next time we were going to talk a little bit about how characters have changed, have evolved in romance. So you want to give us a little teaser, Tab?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think about the romance books that I used to pick up of my mom's, 30, 40 years ago. Because, I was 10. I was definitely reading her books. And there was sort of like a typical kind of romance character, of both the women and the men. And I think now we have a lot more freedom to both deliver the fantasy that we all want and some bit of realistic aspect that we can relate to. You know, we don't only ever want to see the soldier or the, you know, the typical alpha male. You know, like we want to see these guys that are doing interesting different things. We want to see women in positions of authority and in positions of power, but it doesn't have to look like the men. I think there's just so much more we can do with it, even within the tropes that are so popular and that satisfy us so much when we read them and they're done well. And I think maybe we can look at some places where that's done really well and some pointers on that. One last thing I want to say before we end this one though is even if you're
you are also freezing, so we might need to end now and talk about that next
okay.
time. Bye.